February 12, 1951, the Lubyanka Building, Moscow, headquarters of the Ministry of State Security, the MGB, the forerunner to the dreaded KGB. Inside its labyrinthine corridors, far from the prying eyes of the West, a senior colonel in Directorate K, the Counterintelligence Directorate, is delivering a report that brings a rare sense of satisfaction to his superiors. The subject is codenamed the Eagle's Nest, the operational name for the MGB's suffocating surveillance of Spaso House, the official residence of the United States ambassador. For 6 years since the Americans moved in at the close of the Second World War, the residence has been considered the most hostile intelligence environment on Earth, and for 6 years, Directorate K has waged a relentless war to make it their own. The colonel's report is a testament to their perceived success. He details the vast network of informants among the Soviet staff, the maids, the cooks, the drivers, who report every conversation, every guest, every carelessly discarded piece of paper. He describes the fixed surveillance posts in the surrounding buildings, their telephoto lenses trained on the windows, their directional microphones straining to catch a single, intelligible syllable carried on the wind. But the real source of his pride is the technical report. Every few months, under the guise of routine maintenance or during the ambassador's absence, a specialist team of technicians, the best in the Soviet Union, sweeps the ambassador's private study. They are hunting for ghosts. They methodically scan the entire radio spectrum, searching for the telltale emissions of a hidden transmitter. They use primitive X-ray machines to peer into the walls, hunting for wiring that shouldn't be there. They scour every piece of furniture, every lamp, every book, for the holy grail of their trade. A battery pack, the one component a clandestine listening device could not do without. And time after time, their reports come back with the same triumphant conclusion: nothing. The office, they believe, is sterile. The colonel concludes his briefing with the rigid certainty of a man who believes he has mastered his domain. The ambassador's study, he states, remains secure. The Americans have tried, and they have failed. We control the environment. Any attempt to place a device would be detected within hours. The eagle believes his nest is safe, but we are the architects of the cage. This assessment would have been music to the ears of Léon Theremin, Stalin's monstrous secret police chief. In his paranoid world, absolute certainty was the only currency that mattered. And his counterintelligence officers had just assured him that the inner sanctum of his primary adversary was deaf, dumb, and blind. But their certainty, their professionalism, their entire counter-espionage doctrine was built on a foundation of sand. The ultimate irony was that these expert technicians were fighting the last war. Their own masters, in a different, more secret department, had made a technological leap so profound they deliberately kept their own counterintelligence teams in the dark. So, while they were hunting for the technology of the past, devices with batteries, wires, and constant transmissions, a ghost was listening to every word, just a few miles away in the gilded silence of the ambassador's study. And this ghost was a masterpiece of their own state's deception, a device so far beyond their training that they could have held it in their hands and never known what it was. This is the story of a technological checkmate at the dawn of the Cold War. It's the story of how a Soviet listening device operated for 7 years in the heart of the American ambassador's office, a device without a power source, without any active components, and was, for all intents and purposes, invisible to the most sophisticated detection techniques the United States could muster. The Soviets believed their counterintelligence was infallible. They were about to learn that their confidence was a carefully constructed illusion, shattered by an American discovery that would turn their greatest triumph into a global embarrassment. The ultimate listening device wasn't hidden away. It was hiding in plain sight, a Trojan horse that the Soviets had personally delivered, gift-wrapped, straight into the hands of the American ambassador. This failure wasn't just Soviet. It was a blind spot shared by every intelligence agency on Earth. At the time, the entire world of counterespionage was a fortress built on one flawed assumption, that a listening device needed its own power. Every sweep, whether conducted by the Americans searching for Soviet bugs or the Soviets hunting for American ones, was a search for the same holy grail, a battery pack and the radio waves of a constant transmission. This failure wasn't just Soviet. It was a blind spot shared by every intelligence agency on Earth. At the time, the entire world of counterespionage was a fortress built on one flawed assumption, that a listening device needed its own power. Every sweep, whether conducted by the Americans searching for Soviet bugs or the Soviets hunting for American ones, was a search for the same holy grail, a battery pack and the radio waves of a constant transmission. The architect of their future humiliation was a man named Léon Theremin. To the world of the 1920s and 30s, Theremin was a visionary, a celebrity inventor. Living in New York, he had created the ethereal electronic instrument that bears his name, an instrument played without being touched. He was a darling of high society, a peer of Einstein and Eisenhower. Then, in 1938, he vanished. Abducted from his Manhattan apartment by NKVD agents, he was smuggled back to the Soviet Union, charged with counter-revolutionary propaganda, and thrown into the Gulag. But Theremin's genius was too valuable to waste breaking rocks in Siberia. He was transferred to a sharashka, a secret laboratory staffed by prisoner scientists, a concept later immortalized in Alexander Solzhenitsyn's novel The First Circle. Here, under the watchful eye of Lavrenti Beria himself, Theremin and other brilliant minds were forced to create the next generation of surveillance technology for the state that had imprisoned them. It was here, within the gray walls of this scientific prison, that Theremin solved the single greatest problem in clandestine listening: the battery. Batteries died. They were bulky. Their power signatures could be detected. Theremin's solution was to eliminate the power source entirely. His invention, codenamed Burya, or Storm, was a passive cavity resonator. The concept was as elegant as it was revolutionary. The device itself contained no electronic components whatsoever. It consisted of a tiny 9-inch antenna connected to a silver-plated copper cylinder. This cylinder, the cavity, was sealed at one end by a thin, flexible metallic diaphragm, which acted as a microphone. That was it. Here's how this piece of minimalist genius worked. From a surveillance post outside the target building, a van parked on the street, an apartment across the way, Soviet technicians would generate a high-frequency radio signal at precisely 330 megahertz and beam it at the ambassador's office. This signal, the illuminator, was pure, unmodulated energy. When this radio frequency wave struck the antenna on Theremin's device, it caused the cavity to resonate, much like a specific tuning fork vibrates only when the right musical note is played. Inside the office, as the ambassador conducted his sensitive meetings, the sound waves of his voice would strike the thin diaphragm, causing it to vibrate minutely. This vibration changed the physical capacitance of the resonant cavity, ever so slightly altering the way it resonated. The device would then re-radiate or reflect the incoming radio signal back towards the listening post. But the reflected signal was now different. It was subtly modulated by the vibrations of the diaphragm. The listening post would receive this faint echo, filter out the original signal, and demodulate the changes. The result was a crystal-clear reconstruction of the conversation inside the room. It was, in effect, a radio frequency mirror. The Soviets would shine an invisible light into the room, and the mirror, vibrating with the ambassador's words, would reflect back a perfect audio picture. When they turned their illuminator off, the device became nothing more than a tiny, inert piece of metal, utterly invisible to any spectrum analyzer or counter-surveillance sweep. It was the perfect bug. Now all they needed was the perfect delivery system, and in the final days of the Second World War, as the alliance between East and West began to curdle into the Cold War, that opportunity presented itself. On August 4, 1945, a delegation from the Young Pioneer Organization, the Soviet equivalent of the Boy Scouts, arrived at Spaso House. They came to present a gift to the new American ambassador, William Averell Harriman, as a token of friendship and alliance with the Soviet people. The gift was a magnificent hand-carved wooden plaque of the Great Seal of the United States. It was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, a noble eagle clutching arrows and an olive branch. Ambassador Harriman was charmed. Unaware of the Trojan horse he had just been handed, he did exactly what the NKVD hoped he would. He hung the Great Seal in the most sensitive location in all of Soviet-American relations, on the wall of his residential study, directly behind his desk. Tucked away deep inside the wooden eagle's head, behind the beak, was Léon Theremin's masterpiece. The trap was set. The Soviets now had a direct line into the mind of the American mission in Moscow. And for the next 7 years, as a succession of 4 different U.S. ambassadors came and went, the Great Seal hung there, a silent, patient listener, waiting for an invisible beam of energy from a nearby building to bring it to life. The Soviets had achieved the impossible, using a technology so advanced that their own counterintelligence teams, sweeping the very same room, were completely blind to its existence. The eagle's nest was no longer a cage of their design. It was a glass box, and they were the only ones watching. For 7 years, the ghost in Spaso House listened. It heard Ambassador Harriman's candid assessments of Joseph Stalin in the final brutal months of his reign. It captured Ambassador Walter Bedell Smith's private frustrations during the tense negotiations over the Berlin blockade. It recorded Ambassador Alan Kirk's secret cables back to Washington on the development of the Soviet atomic bomb, and it relayed Ambassador George Kennan's own thoughts on the containment strategy he had famously authored. The intelligence haul from Moscow was incalculable. It wasn't just about strategic secrets. It was about psychological insight. They knew when the Americans were bluffing, when they were genuinely concerned, and what their internal talking points were before they ever reached the negotiating table. The Soviets weren't just reading the Americans' mail, they were reading their minds. And the Americans knew something was wrong. The first hints were subtle, almost dismissible, as a coincidence. During high-stakes negotiations, Soviet diplomats would occasionally seem to know the Americans' bottom-line position before it was even stated. In 1951, the suspicion grew. The British Embassy, located nearby, had its own signals intelligence team. During a routine scan of the radio spectrum, a British radio operator noted a strange anomaly. He was monitoring the open-air frequencies used by Soviet Air Force pilots when he picked up what sounded like a clear, unencrypted conversation in English. He recognized the voice. It was Sir Alvary Gascoigne, the British ambassador. The conversation was being rebroadcast on a Soviet military channel. The implications were chilling. The British launched their own frantic top-to-bottom search of their embassy, a sweep codenamed Operation Satyr. They found nothing, but the report was shared with their American allies, confirming a deep-seated fear within the State Department. Moscow was compromised. The eagle's nest was leaking, and no one knew how. The task of finding the leak fell to a new generation of State Department security officers. These were not diplomats. They were technicians, cryptographers, and radio engineers, the vanguard of what would become the Diplomatic Security Service. Their lives were a study in methodical frustration. Year after year, they conducted their own sweeps, just as their Soviet counterparts did. They used the best equipment Washington could provide. They tore open walls, traced every wire, and disassembled furniture piece by piece. They found dead microphones from an earlier era, crude devices left by the NKVD in the 1930s, but they found nothing active. Nothing could explain the hemorrhaging of information they were experiencing in real time. The psychological toll was immense. Paranoia became a permanent resident at Spaso House. Staffers would hold sensitive conversations in hushed tones, often writing notes on magic slates that could be instantly erased. The ambassador's study was considered a hostile zone, a place where the walls themselves were assumed to be listening. Yet every technical sweep came back negative, deepening the mystery and feeding the fear that the leak was human, a well-placed spy among the American staff. The FBI launched multiple, exhaustive counterintelligence investigations. They found no traitor. The ghost remained a ghost. The breakthrough finally came in 1952, not through a feat of advanced technology, but through human curiosity and a stroke of luck. A State Department technician named Joseph Bezian was in Moscow, part of yet another team sent to find the phantom bug. One evening, frustrated after another day of fruitless searching, he was in a makeshift monitoring post, idly scanning the radio spectrum with a simple, wideband receiver. In the residence, Ambassador George Kennan was in his study, practicing a speech he was due to give. As Bezian tuned the dial, he stumbled across a signal. It was faint, but it was unmistakably the voice of the American ambassador. His heart pounded. This was it. But then, as soon as Kennan stopped speaking to turn a page, the signal vanished. When he began reading again, it reappeared. This was the critical observation, the detail that had eluded everyone for 7 years. The bug wasn't constantly transmitting. It was only active when two conditions were met. Someone was speaking in the room, and some other, external radio source was illuminating it. This was the key that unlocked the entire mystery. The Americans now understood they weren't looking for a power source, they were looking for a passive reflector. Bezian and his team quickly cobbled together a new kind of detector, a simple radio receiver connected to a signal generator that could flood the room with different radio frequencies. The idea was to mimic the unknown Soviet illuminator signal and listen for the rebroadcast echo. The receiver screamed. The sound was so loud, so clear that everyone in the room froze. They moved the detector away from the seal, and the sound stopped. They moved it back, and it returned, louder than ever. In a state of disbelief, they carefully lifted the heavy wooden plaque from the wall. It was a cherished object, a gift from the Soviet people, a symbol of a bygone alliance. They carried it to a secure room and began the painstaking process of examining it. On the surface, it was perfect. There were no seams, no drill holes, no obvious signs of tampering. But when they X-rayed it, they saw it. A small, perfectly machined cavity, no bigger than a quarter, with a tiny wire antenna leading from it. It was a space that had no business being there. Carefully, they prized the carving open. And there, nestled inside the eagle's head, was Léon Theremin's ghost. A simple, elegant, terrifying piece of metal that had defeated them for 7 long years. The hunt was over. The thing was found. The discovery of the thing did not trigger an immediate diplomatic firestorm. It triggered a period of intense, top-secret study. The Great Seal was not smashed in anger. It was carefully packaged and flown by diplomatic pouch to Washington, D.C., and then likely handed over to the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency and the brilliant minds in its Office of Scientific Intelligence. For the Americans, this was more than just a security breach. It was a revelation. It was the equivalent of discovering a crashed alien spacecraft. In a secure laboratory, American engineers and scientists did what they did best. They took it apart. They analyzed the metallurgy, the precise dimensions of the resonant cavity, the exact length of the antenna. They were in awe. The device was a masterpiece of minimalist engineering, a testament to a scientific mind operating far outside the box of conventional electronics. There were no vacuum tubes, no wires leading to a power source, no batteries that would degrade over time. It was, as one engineer reportedly remarked, a ghost made of metal. They quickly deduced its operating principle. By bombarding the device with a range of microwave frequencies, they found its resonant sweet spot, 330 megahertz. They replicated the setup, beaming a signal at the bug while speaking, and were met with a crystal-clear audio signal on their receiver. They had reverse-engineered the ghost, and in doing so, they had opened a Pandora's box of new technological possibilities. The discovery of the thing didn't just end a Soviet operation. It kick-started a furious American effort to create their own passive listening devices, an effort that would lead to projects codenamed Easy Chair and Satyr, and an entirely new chapter in the electronic arms race. Meanwhile, back in Moscow, the Soviet technicians in Directorate K were experiencing their own quiet sense of dread. One day, their golden goose simply stopped laying eggs. The listening post, likely a nondescript apartment or a specially equipped van parked near Spaso House, would beam its 330 megahertz signal towards the ambassador's study and receive nothing back but a faint, unmodulated echo. At first, it would have been dismissed as equipment failure. They would have checked their transmitters, their receivers, their antennas. But as days turned into weeks, a chilling realization would have settled in. The device was gone. Had it been damaged? Had it been moved? Or, in the worst-case scenario imaginable, had it been found? For the MGB, the silence from Spaso House was more terrifying than any message they had ever intercepted. Their perfect operation, their window into the American soul, had been slammed shut, and they had no idea if the Americans were now staring back through the glass. For 8 years, the United States government kept its discovery a closely guarded secret. The Great Seal and its metallic parasite were locked away. The knowledge was used to develop new, far more sophisticated counter-surveillance sweep techniques. The State Department now knew what to look for, not just active transmitters, but inert pieces of metal that could be awakened by an external energy source. The game had changed, and only one side knew the new rules. The Americans chose to wait, holding their trump card for a moment of maximum geopolitical leverage. That moment arrived on May 1, 1960. A high-altitude American U-2 spy plane, piloted by Francis Gary Powers, was shot down by a Soviet surface-to-air missile while flying a reconnaissance mission deep inside the Soviet Union. The incident blew up the upcoming Four-Power Summit in Paris and gave Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev a global stage to denounce American aggression and espionage. Khrushchev was furious, righteous, and loud. He condemned the United States as a treacherous spy, a nation that spoke of peace, while its aircraft violated Soviet sovereignty. The international pressure on Washington was immense. At the United Nations Security Council, the Soviet delegation called an emergency session to officially condemn the United States. On May 26, 1960, as the world's media watched, the Soviet representative delivered a blistering tirade against American imperialism. Then, it was the American turn to speak. The U.S. ambassador to the UN, Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., walked calmly to the podium. The expectation was that he would offer a weak defense, a series of denials or justifications. He did nothing of the sort. Instead of papers, he brought a prop. He gestured for an aide who brought forward the magnificent wooden carving of the Great Seal of the United States. Lodge addressed the council. "I want to show you a gift that was presented by the Soviets to the American ambassador in Moscow." He proceeded to tell the story of the young pioneers and their token of friendship. Then came the moment of pure political theater. With a small tool, he pried open the wooden seal, revealing the tiny cavity and the metallic device nestled within. "Here," he announced, his voice ringing through the chamber, "is the listening device." He explained in simple, damning terms how this passive bug had been used to eavesdrop on 4 successive American ambassadors for 7 years. The ghost of Spaso House was finally being shown to the world. In one stunning move, Lodge had completely deflated the Soviet Union's righteous indignation. He had proven, with undeniable physical evidence, that the espionage game was played by both sides, and that the Soviets were not just players, but masters of a dark and duplicitous craft. The chamber was stunned into silence. The Soviet delegation sat stone-faced, their carefully constructed narrative of victimhood utterly demolished in a single, masterful stroke of Cold War showmanship. The impact of Henry Cabot Lodge Jr.'s reveal was immediate and catastrophic for the Soviet Union's international standing. The story of the Boy Scout bug, as the press dubbed it, became an instant legend of Cold War spycraft. Khrushchev's narrative of American treachery was completely undercut by a simple piece of wood and metal. He had been caught red-handed, not just spying, but doing so in a manner so audacious and cynical, using children as a cover, that it stripped him of all moral high ground. The Paris summit remained dead, but now the blame was shared. For the intelligence services on both sides, the revelation was a tectonic shift. For the KGB, it was a moment of profound humiliation and introspection. Their entire counterintelligence doctrine had been proven obsolete. The 7 years of confident reports declaring the ambassador's study sterile were now a source of deep institutional shame. How many other secrets had they missed? What other invisible technologies were the Americans deploying against them? The paranoia that they had so expertly cultivated in their adversaries now came home to roost in the halls of the Lubyanka. An immediate top priority directive was issued: develop techniques and equipment to find passive, non-radiating, illuminated bugs. The age of simply scanning the radio spectrum was over. The ghost hunters had to learn how to hunt for ghosts that made no sound. For the Americans, it was a wake-up call of equal magnitude. They had been penetrated deeply and consistently for 7 years. The discovery spurred a massive investment in what became known as Technical Surveillance Countermeasures, or TSCM. The Diplomatic Security Service was professionalized and expanded, its agents armed with new devices like nonlinear junction detectors, designed specifically to find inert electronics, whether they were turned on or not. Every U.S. embassy in a hostile country was now considered a potential target for this kind of advanced attack. The era of assuming a room was secure was over. From 1960 onward, the operating assumption was that every room was compromised until proven otherwise. The ultimate Soviet concession didn't come in a public apology or a UN resolution. It came in the quiet, professional fear that permeated their intelligence services for the rest of the Cold War. Years later, high-level defectors from the KGB and GRU would speak of this persistent technological dread. Oleg Kalugin, a former KGB major general who rose to the head of foreign counterintelligence, described a system constantly terrified of American innovation. He spoke of the shock that would ripple through Moscow whenever the Americans unveiled a new capability, the SR-71, the KH-11 satellite, or stealth technology that seemed to come from another century. The thing was the first of these shocks. It wasn't just a gadget. It was a conceptual leap that made their own best efforts feel crude and clumsy. It proved that the Americans weren't just playing the game. They were capable of changing the very laws of physics the game was played by. So we return to where we started, that confident colonel in the Lubyanka in 1951, so sure of his tradecraft, so certain of his control. His fortress of certainty was breached not by a rival spy or a better weapon, but by an idea born in the mind of a Soviet prisoner, Léon Theremin, and perfected by American engineers. A weapon that was delivered by his own side and hung on the wall by his enemy, a weapon that worked by being invisible to the very definition of detection. The story of the Great Seal bug is more than a tale of clever spycraft. It is a perfect metaphor for the entire technological conflict of the Cold War. The Soviet system, for all its power and paranoia, was rigid. It hunted for known threats and prepared for the last war. It could not anticipate the quantum leap, the elegant solution that came from outside its rigid worldview. In the end, the most effective listening device in history wasn't a product of brute force, but of sheer ingenuity. A silent ghost of metal and air that for 7 long years sat in the heart of the American mission in Moscow, listening, a chilling testament to the fact that in the shadow war of secrets and lies, the most dangerous weapon is the one you can't even imagine exists.